From the world of AV programming and control with James King, I'm Steve Greenblatt, and this is Ask the Programmer. James, we're back, and we have, since our last episode was so interesting and popular, we're going to continue the conversation today. So how are you? And we'll then introduce our guest.
I'm doing good. And again, this topic, I actually think this topic is almost one of the reasons why we kind of started as the programmer, one of the founding. So this should be a good one for our listeners.
Absolutely. So if you didn't catch our last episode, episode 62, we were able to speak with Patrick Murray. He talked to us about how software solutions can replace hardware solutions. So Patrick came back for another time. We haven't scared him off. So welcome back, Patrick. How are you?
Thanks for having me, Steve. It's going to take more than that to scare me off. I love talking about this stuff.
And if you didn't get to listen to the last episode, please do. But we're gonna keep talking about the rise of software solutions. Now we're going to steer the conversation a little bit more toward what impact does this have on programmers. So as Patrick said in the last episode, he has a website called learnavprogramming.com, which is helps programmers learn some more mainstream programming offerings. And as James said, when, very early on from this conversation, we try in this podcast, we look to build community for programmers, but also be a resource to help programmers get a voice and learn and grow. So let's kind of dive into that a little bit as to when a programmer is in a situation now where they've invested a lot of time and effort into learning AV programming, which is in itself its own animal. It's not something that you learn at school. It's not something that you necessarily have too many resources to learn, but it has a lot of value if you become an expert. It may be daunting now to take another shift to change course there. James, I'll let you give me some insight on that. If you were to, when you're looking at that, what would you recommend to somebody to have to look at learning some either new languages or a new approach to programming?
Well, if you guys have been following me, I'm all about learning. If you're not out there advancing, learning, honing your craft, then you're stagnant. There's a saying in a book I was reading that if mountains were smooth, we wouldn't be able to climb them. So you're going to have rough. You got to struggle. You have to push the envelopes. You got to learn new things. Otherwise, you're not growing. You're not advancing. And you're not really becoming a true SME, because what's going to happen, you might be an SME in product A, and then that dies off. Are you even good? I mean, look at the COBOL programmers. COBOL died. They're not doing anything now, except for these legacy systems that only those people know how to program, but they're few and far behind now.
I think that's a really great point, actually. If you think about it, you're learning a craft that is very, very, very niche and could be very valuable, but how does that transfer over to other things? And as you mentioned, part of that is the fact that when you're in a situation and you're dependent on others, you don't have control over your own destiny. So Patrick, as we discussed in the last episode, you had mentioned about the fact that you started off doing independent programming and programming as part of a team, and you saw this opportunity to shift gears. So what does that look like? Because you did it very, from an outsider's view, very elegantly, and it was something that you seemed to have a nice transition. But I'm not sure that everybody else can do it that way.
Yeah. So the internet only shows you the highlight reel. It was far from elegant, but that's part of learning, is making mistakes. So all those, When you compile something or run something, you get all these errors in there in red. Don't take them personally. Just go through them one by one and fix them. And through that process, that's how you learn. So if there's one thing I can recommend to anybody, even if they have no intention of changing, and it's just to learn, do something small, do the Hello World project of a new language once a month. It will expand the way you do your other programming, right? If you do a Hello World in JavaScript or Ruby or whatever it is, you might look at your other programming in a different way. So there's value even in it, even if you don't use it in your job. So that's the first, is just take it step by step and view it as a way to just become a better, well-rounded programmer. Now, the other part of it is, what's the risk of staying with a proprietary system? And there is risk there. We should never fool ourselves. And I've been saying this for 10 years, and I've been wrong for the past 10 years, right? All these companies are still there doing their thing, and they may be here in 10 or 20 or whatever more years. But right now, this supply chain crunch is showing its value, being skilled in deploying a website or deploying an app or being able to deploy a control application on a virtual machine or whatever computer is available. And the only reason I could do that now when it's needed is because I prepared for it. So that's the analysis that you need to make for yourself, and then decide how deep you want to dive into it.
So with that, and I know that this is something that you take a lot of pride in, is there a recipe to get started? Is it something that somebody picks a language, or do they look at a need, or do they, or is there some general foundation that they need to build to be able to say, I want to get into modern programming. I know that I don't want to find myself trapped in a proprietary world.
Sure. I think, from my perspective, the most basic thing to do would be to make an HTML5 project with one button on it and have it execute some JavaScript code on your laptop. And maybe open a TCP connection to something on your local network and just see it with your own eyes, like follow that chain. I press the button, it makes that request to the JavaScript code, however that happens, right? And then you have this mental model of how that communication path works. And then from the JavaScript code, that TCP socket, oh, wow, I could open these myself without some proprietary software. You mean anybody could open up sockets on a network? Yes, you can. And once you do it, and there's plenty of tutorials out there, it's ridiculous. This stuff is wide open and freely available, and you will make mistakes. Some things will go wrong and you'll scratch your head, and you will figure it out too. And just like, when we learn these proprietary languages to begin with, it's also very confusing. It's really complicated. I remember going to a training for one manufacturer. I won't mention any names, but I was sitting at lunch with another programmer there, and he knew that I did all these other programming languages. And I said, it's hard to get an overview of what's going on. And he started laughing because he said, you're a programmer for that, and you think this stuff is complicated? And that just goes back to this, I have my mental model, I have my habits, I know what I know, and you're almost too close to remember that everything has a learning curve, and complexity is baked into everything that we do.
I think that makes a lot of sense, because I tell people all the time, if you ask like what's better, one or the other, it's the one that you're most comfortable with and the one that you've probably done the most. And everybody always looks at the other one and say that one's more difficult.
Sure.
James, as somebody in your position, and you've talked a lot about how you have side projects and that's how you learn. What would you recommend to somebody that is either working on your team or somebody who wants to break into the industry and say, I see this programming thing as something that excites me. How do I go about getting involved? Because that person has a clean slate.
I agree. Not to be a dead horse, but again, have a project in mind. Kind of like Patrick was saying, do a little project on your laptop, try to control something. Find something that you are interested in because that interest will keep you trying to figure out the solution for it. Like I said, one of the side projects I did, I was teaching myself with Python was I was doing a aquarium controller. That was controlling lights, it was controlling power outlets, which were all new to me at that time. And yes, I made mistakes. I went and fixed those mistakes. Like Patrick said, you figure it out, you learn from your mistakes. So if you don't have a project or a goal in mind, you're throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what stick. And you may be lost. You might get confused and get too much in the weeds and get frustrated and leave because you don't have that goal or that end goal in sight. So I think having a project in mind, again, not to be a dead horse, I'll keep saying it, have a project in mind.
Absolutely. I totally get that. And, and I think that there's a lot of tinkering that people do these days, and there's a lot of communities that you can get involved with and learn. And I mean, even down to kids in school, they're working with Raspberry Pi, and they're doing robotics clubs and so on and so forth. So there are different ways to learn. What I hear from my team is that once you get knowledge of how to approach a object-oriented programming, and it's a matter of learning different syntax when going from one language to another for the most part. But obviously you want to pick the right language for what you're trying to accomplish, or the best one for the task at hand. With that said, Patrick, I know that you have provided some training for people, which we mentioned last time at learnavprogramming.com. Is there a recipe for that, that you would say to somebody, take this course, learn this, kind of get this background on your own? How would they prepare to get involved in learning either from your site or some other place?
It depends on the starting point, of course. Are you brand new to programming and writing code? Do you understand the signal flow in an AV control system? Those are kind of the baseline questions you need to ask yourself. If you're don't want to start writing code, I think Node-RED is a really interesting way. I mean, it's amazing how fast you can make things happen. That being said, it's kind of a drag and drop block editor, but they have like a TCP block. They have a user interface block. So you could get buttons on an HTML page, connections to AV devices, and be passing stuff along. And you could learn it in a day, in a couple hours. A seasoned AV programmer would, in like an hour or two, they'd have a system up and running. The problem is any kind of complexity gets totally out of hand because it's this visual block with lines being drawn. It doesn't scale at all. You can make it work. You can make 100 rooms work with it, but if you have to fix something, it's not going to be any fun at all. Don't ask me how I know that.
And I think we've seen other situations that like that in AV as well.
Of course, right? Scaling and keeping things organized as the complexity grows can easily become an afterthought. And you need to get bitten first to be able to keep that in mind as you move forward. But if you're ready to jump into code and you don't know where to start, I'd just say learn some JavaScript, because the intention of JavaScript was to be easy. It was for people to share code, copy and paste, be able to kind of read it and understand what's going on. And it's become so powerful. You can make reusable code with it. You can make classes. It can be object oriented. Things like Node.js make it almost real time, as good as real time. So I would look into JavaScript as a starting point, for sure.
So which is great. So that will really help our listeners out there looking to start. And I think the common theme of what we've talked about sounds a lot like web technologies. So that's another area that I would assume would be worth looking into and getting comfortable with. But as you mentioned too, you have to know that foundation of how do you talk to a device and what is required to put an AV system together. So
those are really interesting points, if I may interrupt, because web technologies are as far as they are because the biggest companies in the world are constantly investing in making them better and better and better. But the flip side of that is that AV has kind of been ignoring it. So if you marry those two things, I mean, it's all of this stuff just waiting for us to take advantage of. So I see a lot of opportunity there, and I think many people would be surprised about at how robust it is, web technologies in general.
To jump in on what Patrick was saying, I think that's a good point. And because you have these big tech giants who are throwing a lot of money into the web developing and all that stuff. And I'm thinking we're going to start seeing those in AV. I don't think, Steve, you were at NAB this year, but I walked at NAB in Vegas, and you had Amazon AWS there, Microsoft was there. I think was another big tech company at a NAB. Also, with Hewlett Packard purchasing Poly, that's another tech giant getting into UC and AV. I agree with Patrick. I think once the tech giants are dumping their money in, we're going to see a huge change in AV.
So this is a great way for us to kind of wrap this one up. If we take our crystal ball out, and this has been a threat for a long time, saying that somebody's going to come in and disrupt our industry, not who is it going to be, but what is that going to look like? Do you have a sense for that, James?
I really, tell you the truth, I don't know. Because if you were going to tell me Hewlett Packard would have been one of the first ones, I would have been like, you're out of your mind. And they're one of the first ones, I feel. So I'm really at a loss. I think Microsoft is going to come at it, but I feel they're going to come at it differently. And they're going to, instead of going on the bandwagon as is now, they're going to jump ahead 5-10 years and try to say, hey, catch up to us. That's what my feeling is with Microsoft. I'd be shocked if Apple doesn't start putting something out. But again, we know Apple is very close and very lip sealed, so we don't hear much from them, I feel.
Patrick, I'll let you wrap this one up. It's a similar question to this, not necessarily who or what is it going to be, but isn't it interesting that many of the people that James just mentioned or have been in the AV world for a long time using what we're doing? You would think that they would be looking at it from a different angle and saying, maybe we could do this differently. And any thoughts there?
Well, it's been happening. It's already happened. We talk about disruption all the time. AV has been disrupted many times over. But just moving from RGB HV to Cat 5, and now we have video over IP. I mean, we're doing it. And like 10 years ago, it was like, nah. And now we're doing it. You have to know how to configure the switch to make that stuff work. That's a disruption in my book. Mm-hmm. If you're talking about how we do business and what manufacturers and the dealers and things like that, who knows how that'll develop, because those kind of companies adapt. We have to. But I think this idea that there'll be an AV system for all AV systems will never happen. I know it for a fact, because the custom projects that I do, there's no way you could productize that. Maybe I could productize it for one department of a county in a state somewhere but that's a project that I'm just making standards for. There's never going to be this company that comes out like, here's your AV system, just plug it in. So there's always going to be room for customization. But on the flip side of that, you can roll out a couple hundred rooms with an out of the box system, like, and things like Zoom rooms where you don't need a touch panel, it's already done. But if you want to control the lights, then you might have a problem. So, those are like the two sides of the coin. There'll be use cases where it's all ready to go, but there'll always be opportunity for customization.
I think that's a good place for us to stop, because it sounds like it's a high note and encouragement for programmers. Patrick, how can people, thank you for being with us again, first off, but how can people get in touch with you, learn what you're up to, and also get their feet wet in more programming for that, or more future-proof programming, let's call it.
Thanks for inviting me to the show. It's a pleasure as always. Go to learnavprogramming.com. There's all sorts of free material there, and you could sign up for a newsletter. There's a contact form. You could reach out to me directly, or feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn.
And thank you for that. And James, how can people get in touch with you and learn what you're up to?
As always, just Google me. You'll find me. I'm on Twitter, AV_James King. You can find Steve and I on Sunday morning talking about AV in the AM. So you can find me out there.
And being that James gave Patrick the endorsement on the last one, I'll give him the endorsement on this one. I've had members of my team go through his class, so please check it out. It's definitely a great way to get involved and build a foundation that you can move forward with, and also you can. It's a good way to kind of test if this is something for you or not. So. For me, you can reach me at Steve Greenblatt on social media. Twitter and LinkedIn are the best spots. I write for a couple of publications. Most of my work can be found on avnetwork.com, and I'm also on my company blog at controlconcepts.net. And with that, been another great episode for Ask the Programmer.